Wow, I finally made it to the Western world. It is so nice to ditch the crowded and disgusting Great Britain. Oh look, a native! I come in peace.
Dude, speak English. So, what are you here for?
I'm trying to find the colony. They call it Jamestown.
Yeah, never heard of that place. You know, this is kind of my land, so what exactly are you here for?
Well, I came to the New World to find economic and religious freedom.
Uh-huh. Well, you know, this is still kind of my land.
Oh, here it is. It's the colony, Jamestown. Hundreds of acres of tobacco, just how I pictured.
Everybody, this is period 2, an extensive review. We're going to be going over 1607 through 1754. Our main concepts today are colonization, mercantilism, colonial life, and identity and culture. We're going to start with colonization. So, starting off from 1607, European and native relationships were hostile, land disagreements, and there was a lot of and a great example could be the Powhatan and the Virginians in Jamestown. So from Jamestown, we have the first settlement of an English colony. Virginia Company came there in 1607, first place to have African slaves on a Dutch, they came from a Dutch ship. And from there, up north, in the northern parts of the colonies, north and further North America, we have French colonization, 1608. The French had been trading furs and tools with the Native Americans. Furs were very lucrative at the time. Dutch colonization, starting in 1609 or 1613, or through 1613. They settled in places such as New Amsterdam, which would be modern-day New York, whilst the English settled in southern regions or up north. Tobacco, major crop, a lot of very lucrative. Colonies were well known for cultivating this, and this is what makes Jamestown and Virginia very essential for a lot of colonization efforts. Foundation of Massachusetts, 1620. We have Puritans and plenty of other people seeking religious freedom, which would later on come to Puritan colonization, where we have many people seeking religious freedom. We would later see plenty more people seek religious freedom in the colonies, one of the main reasons why they would settle there in the first place. With all these religions, such as Catholics, Puritans, Presbyterians, this would create some disputes between the two religious between many religious groups, thus developing a solution to all this, which would be the Toleration Act of 1649, Maryland, which had basically just to make sure everyone has religious equality. So then we go back to hostile European and Native American relationships. King Philip's War, Metacom's War, first large European and Native American conflict. This would later create fears and thus make retaliation efforts, creating the Bacon's Rebellion, which would be against the Virginian governor William Berkeley, thus for the reason to attack the natives, as well as an attempt to expand land regions in Virginia. Some successful revolts from the Native Americans would be such as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. They had attacked the Spanish, and they succeeded in taking land. In the future, we would see plenty of wars, a collective, which would be the War for Empire. One of the first ones we would see is Queen Anne's War in 1701. Spanish succession fought between 1701 and 1714. The fundamental issues included the rivalry of France and England in America, and a conflict that had been unresolved by the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697. Future land disputes and British disputes would later on in 1750s would later result in wars such as the French and Indian War, but that is in a later time period.
All right, the second topic we have today is mercantilism. And in 1650, the British government pursued a policy of mercantilism in international trade, a trade system where Americans provided raw goods to Britain, and Britain used the raw goods to produce manufactured goods that were sold in European markets and back to the colonies. The colonies were captive markets for British industry, and the goal was to enrich the mother country. Indentured servitude died off in the 1650s, and due to the availability of African slave labor and the cheap cost of acquiring it, plantation-heavy economies decided to drop the long-lasting indentured servitude from about 1607 to the 1650s and began to start focusing on cultivating with African slave labor. From 1651 to 1673, the English Parliament passed 4 navigation acts meant to ensure the proper mercantilist trade balance. The acts declare the following: only English or English colonial ships could carry cargo between imperial ports. Certain goods, including tobacco, rice, and furs, could not be shipped to foreign nations except through England or Scotland. The English Parliament would pay bounties to Americans who produced certain raw goods, while raising protectionist tariffs on the same goods produced in other nations. Americans could not compete with English manufacturers in large-scale manufacturing. The Navigation Act severely restricted colonial trade to the benefit of England. Colonists' reactions to these acts would end up in violence and anger, usually ending in property damage or outrageous riots. Colonial tension to this would be common to this and drag onwards to later years.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the English colonies. And basically, during this time period, solitary neglect was going on, and this was the policy of an intentional lack of enforcement by the British government on the American colonies. And the next big event that happened in the colonies was Bacon's Rebellion, which we talked about a little bit before, but basically Bacon's Rebellion was aimed to overthrow the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, in order to have the right to claim land from the natives. So now we're going to talk about the Dominion of New England, which was formed in 1686, and it merged the colonies Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island into the Dominion of New England. But however, it ended in 1689 after King James II was dethroned from England due to the Glorious Revolution. And the failure, basically, this temporarily changed many British officials' attitudes toward the American colonies. So now we're going to talk about the New England colonies.
Pilgrims settled this territory. In 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Company was established and thrived in farming, hunting, and fishing. New England settlers, who were against the Puritan-dominated society of Massachusetts, moved to Rhode Island for greater religious freedom.
So first, we have the middle colonies, which were known as the breadbasket colonies for producing grains. These colonies included Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. And unlike Puritan New England, the middle colonies presented an assortment of religions. Okay, now we're going to talk about the southern colonies, which were basically, they involved large-scale tobacco farming, which caused slavery to be the most popular option for cheap labor. Now we're going to talk about the Stono Rebellion, which this was in 1739. Slaves tried to escape South Carolina in order to seek freedom to Spanish-run Florida. However, they failed, and this started the beginning of the acts opposed on slaves.
To identity and culture. Women's roles in the colonies varied greatly from colony to colony from different ethnic groups. We have the European establishments being as running a domestic household, raising children, and basically preparing foods and meals for the males and other things. The Virginia House of Burgesses in which popularly elected legislator would be able to assemble together and be able to decide the laws.
Wait a sec. Town meetings are for the boys. Only white landowning men in Virginia could participate in town meetings and local government.
Slave codes. So, slave codes were basically the laws so that you wouldn't be so that Europeans or anybody who is of white color could not marry a black African. That would be very important in the future and would basically be cultural. Now, this guy right here, John Locke, is an important Enlightenment thinker. The two treaties of government influenced wars and other political leaders. We see this later on with the American Revolution. We have the slave revolts in the West Indies, trying to take back islands. Haitian revolts, such as that. And then the biggest out of all these different affairs would be the First Great Awakening, an evangelical revival, Christian revivals that impacted American colonies in 1730s and 1740s. This is very big for the Americans as this kind of brought back religion and kind of was incorporated into almost everyday American life.
And next, we're going to start with our APUSH historical reasoning skills. And these skills are brought to you by College Board because they integrate them to the AP curriculum, so it gears students towards reading and processing historical information like a historian, so students can succeed on analyzing sources on the AP test. Our first historical reasoning skill that we have is contextualization, because basically the skill requires students to connect historical periods and events in terms of regional, national, and global affairs. This includes understanding the consequences and changes in a time period based off previous changes and using content to explain historical significance of events. For example, you can use the Vietnam War as an example in context with the Cold War, decolonization, nationalism movements at the time. Our second historical reasoning skill is comparison, which includes using resources from the past and connecting them to other sources of info or time periods. This includes comparing and contrasting similar developments and specific differences to conclude the distinctions from both periods. For example, on the photo on the right, we have economic similarities and differences after World War I, World War II, which is a great use of comparison. Our third historical reasoning skill is causation, which mainly is the how or why specific events occur in history. This also includes connections and distinctions of consequences and actions that connect to an event. For example, the causations leading up to the Civil War include compromises, the Mexican-American War, the debates over Western expansion of slavery, creation of the Republican Party, and the election of Republican President Abraham Lincoln. With causation, historians can identify why events occur. Finally, the last historical reasoning skill is continuity and change over time. Historians are always fascinated with continuity and change over time. The simplest one to identify is change, when something new happens, but the hardest one to see is the continuity because it is harder to spot and is less dramatic. This would include the continuity of immigration patterns persisting since the 19th century to 1965, when major changes in the immigration patterns would increase. What is seen is that continuity keeps record of what hasn't changed rather than what did.